Hello and welcome to the Be Formless Flow Driven CEO and VC podcast, where we are reshaping life, leadership, business, and investing from the inside out. And today I am welcoming from the show from I've only been there once, but I would like to say it's one of my favorite cities in the world, Amsterdam. Welcome to the show, Kim Odhner.
Thank you, B. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
And you're always welcome to join us here in Amsterdam.
Yeah, it's just so beautiful. All the canals, and I've only ever been there I think in the summer. And what's the park called? Vondel Park. There's just so many beautiful aspects to it. And how long did you say you've been in Amsterdam now? 8 years?
For about 8 years.
Yeah.
It's, I guess one of the things that people typically don't know about the Netherlands is it's one of the largest exporters of food worldwide
Really?
after the United States and China or something. So
Yeah.
my journey to Amsterdam really came from being based in the US, just briefly, actually, after living in Asia for many years. As we set up, as we started to invest the New Crop Capital Trust, I was traveling to the Netherlands, and we were investing in food at the time, and I just wasn't aware of the fact that the Netherlands was such a large exporter of food. But it seemed sensible to me that we should have a footprint here
Yeah,
in this,
100%.
and so that's kind of how it came to pass.
Very cool. Very
The
cool. Well,
little fun
we're gonna get
facts about the Netherlands.
yeah, we're gonna get into this story. I'm gonna start with you have two children, a daughter and a son, and you can tell us about their diverse careers that they are pursuing, and we'll talk about that in a second. You're co-founder and managing partner of Unovis Asset Management, which is and you're a global food tech investor. You've got 25 plus years in private equity and venture capital. You're a board director and driving the protein transition, which we will also get into. So Unovis Asset Management, it's a global investment firm focused on transforming the food system through alternative proteins and sustainable, or let's say regenerative food technologies, given the previous conversation I just had on sustainable and regenerative. 25 years of experience investing across Europe, Asia, and North America. Your perspective has been shaped by working across the different markets, the cycles, and the ways of building, seeing firsthand where capital accelerates change and where it can fall short. At Unovis Asset Management, Kim and you and your team work with founders to rethink how food is produced and consumed, backing the companies that sit within a much larger ecosystem shift, one that requires not just innovation, instead of fundamental change in how industries evolve. And then your lens reflects, from what I understand, a deeper question within venture today. And that's not just how to scale companies, it's instead how to participate in transforming ecosystems that are no longer fit for purpose, and what role capital consciously can play in that process. Tell us a little bit about how you came into the food ecosystem, if you like, and what was it, a passion? How did it all start? Tell us a bit about your journey.
Okay. I would say that my journey, it's funny the way that you've actually phrased that kind of leads me back a little bit earlier than I probably would have started this conversation.
Okay.
Back in, back in 1993, going way back.
Cast your mind back, everybody.
Yeah, living in New York City at the time. I was working in the garment district of New York, and I had a sales job, and so I was traipsing around meeting with different garment importers that were importing from all over the world, principally from the Far East. And somebody mentioned to me that there was some threat at the time that the United States and China were sort of having one of these typical sort of trade wars or saber rattling during the Clinton administration. And they talked about withdrawing most favored nation trading status. And so at the time, everybody was looking at Vietnam, because Vietnam was just starting to open up. And with new countries where there's no importation data, they at the time didn't assign quota, and quota is, limitations on the amount that can be imported from that country. And so all these garment importers, big names like Jordache and just all sorts of, at the time, very popular garment importers were very, very interested in what this might mean for the industry. So I got curious about Vietnam, and I didn't know anything about it. But by the end of 1990, I decided that I was going to make a secret trip to Vietnam to explore what was happening there and whether or not there was a garment importing market to be had, whether they could manufacture garments and whether they would be exporting to the United States. So I made a trip over Christmas to Vietnam and explored both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City to see whether or not I could set up a garment sourcing agency. Young and inexperienced, I arrived in a former communist country or a communist country
Mm.
with very, very, very little infrastructure. And I remember traveling in from the airport in Hanoi in an old Russian Lada with a fan on the dashboard, trying to keep the car cool in that tropical heat. But ultimately, I won't spend too much time on this story, but basically that sort of kicked off a real pivot in my life. Having lived in New York City for about 5 years, it was time for a change anyway. My wife was just finishing up her master's degree at Columbia. So we picked up and we moved to Asia for the summer in 1994. We lived in Hanoi, we taught English, and I explored kind of the garment manufacturing industry, started visiting factories and things like that. And at the time, Vietnam was manufacturing and exporting principally to the Russian, the former Soviet Union
Yeah.
countries, the Comcon countries. And so they had the ability to manufacture garments, and they were actually pretty good at it. They did winter coats and things like that. But the quality of the product was not great. The manufacturing itself was good, but the quality of the
Yeah.
inputs was very poor. Things like buttons, zippers, threads, and things like that were not fantastic. Anyway, the long and the short of it is I concluded that actually there wasn't really a garment industry to be had there. And so it was too early. And so when I
Very
returned to New York to prepare in that last year to move back out to Asia, we made the decision to move. I got a job with a venture capital firm based out of Hong Kong. And so when we moved to Asia, I started out in Hong Kong. My wife went down to Hanoi, and I was splitting my time between Hong Kong and Hanoi. And you'll appreciate this story. At the time, we invested in this Australian gentleman who had seeded a few projects in Hanoi, joint ventures, because Vietnam still, as a communist country, had not established businesses yet. So there was no such thing as a private enterprise. It was
wow.
still government you sign
Yeah.
joint ventures with government enterprises. So this man had set up a couple of joint ventures to build some of the first commercial office buildings in Hanoi. Because if you think about it, in a developing country like that, I mean, there was no place for, foreign investors to come and settle and have, basic infrastructure that they needed in order to operate from. And so that portfolio, he was supposed to develop those projects, and I won't get into the details, but he didn't wind up being able to complete those projects. So I was sent down to Hanoi to complete
Take over.
these projects. And so my claim to fame is I built one of the first commercial office buildings in Hanoi.
Oh,
So
wow, that's a great
I was
story.
a commercial developer. And so kind of going back to your story, I mean, I guess arriving in that country, trying to navigate my way around,
Mm.
trying to build a team of people that I could work with, working with a joint venture partner who was in his, then late 50s, communist, brought up through the communist military and then industrial background. I had to learn Vietnamese, so I learned to speak some Vietnamese, and I managed a team of about 15 people. And we built this office building, and our first clients were all the big name people like Heineken and Kodak and Hewlett Packard, all
Yeah,
these
cool. Great
first
brand.
arrivers that
Funny.
came into the country.
Yeah.
Anyway, that experience really, really kind of, it was not just that sort of that arrival, but after, working for several years and then building up that business and then invest in being involved in the investment of other businesses in that market, in those emerging markets, it made me realize that, these things, it's all secular. I mean, all these things,
Yeah.
industries build up, infrastructure is built up, people's intelligence or their intellect, their experience grows as they learn new things from foreign investors and things like that. So the evolution is ever thus. I mean, there's economies, countries. There's a constant evolution
I
in
just wrote
people.
continuous. I just wrote down it's a continuous cycle. When you were saying cyclical, it is. It's continuous. There's
It really
highs,
is.
lows, in betweens. It's like you know, you create, you dissolve, you reshape, you reset, you recalibrate. It is a continuous cycle, isn't it?
It really is. And I guess the thing is that you come in and you're an expert in an emerging market. No country is an emerging market in perpetuity. They emerge and then they evolve, right? So they're constantly evolving and they're becoming more sophisticated. They're things like we saw the arrival of things like fresh vegetable oils, and then we saw the arrival of washing machines, and then we saw the arrival of air conditioners and things like that. I mean, all these things didn't exist in that market. I mean, I imported one of the elevators, lifts into the country post 1965 or something like that, post Vietnam War.
Crazy.
All these things. There was a first for everything, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, the point is that if you carry that forward, nothing stays the same. And if you build a business or if you build a career around something that you think is going to remain the way it is today, then that's your first mistake, because people evolve, systems evolve. During that time, we moved from communicating with our families through fax machines to rudimentary email, and where we used to use maps to get around. By the time we left Asia, of course, we were doing what everybody else
Like
was doing.
travel books.
We were using, yeah,
I've still
exactly,
got them. I've still got some of those Lonely Planet books where I used to highlight through, like, we're
yeah,
showing our age a bit here, Kim. I mean, I
yeah.
did when I was, 20 traveling the world.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so and that sort of brings me all the way forward to the food system, but I'll get there in a second. But one of the things that I realized after working in Asia, living and working in Asia for 25 years, is that there's a time after which Westerners, it used to be that we were the consigliatories. We were the ones that actually facilitated inward investment from the West into. We brought experience, we brought trust, we brought kind of feet on the ground, a trusted pair of hands, all that sort of stuff, right? And also education. I mean, we trained people in a subtle way. We brought some of that experience with us, and so throughout that period of time, obviously that evolved. And what I sort of witnessed over time was that by the time I left Asia, there were plenty of very bright, well-educated, very experienced people that had come up through the system, during the time that I'd been there working and acting in that capacity. And so, 15, 25 years later, people like us were not needed in the same way. And so, and a lot of those markets that were emerging during that time have effectively emerged. And they're more advanced economies today than they were at the time that I spent my years, toiling in those markets. So, and that really lends itself very, very well to the food system as well. So, I mean, if you look at when I finished up in Asia, I basically concluded, I mean, where I found myself really, really focusing after investing other people's money for many, many years, is I found myself increasingly getting embedded into private equity investments where I was asked to come in and fix problems, or go in as a general director or a managing director and restructure the company and things like that. And that kind of work is necessary, and it can be remunerative, but it's also pretty depressing too, because
No.
you're also you're often fixing other people's problems or mistakes that they made along the way in terms of investment and things like that, or malalignment between local parties and foreign parties and things like that.
Is it depressing, Kim? Sorry, can we just pause on that for a second? Is it depressing because it's not something that you would have created, if that makes sense? Like, what's depressing about it? You're coming in, you're fixing someone else's problem. It's, it's a mess sort of thing. You're coming into a mess and you're like, how did this get here? Like, what's the depressing piece? Or does it come down to also relationships, the way people have been treated, bad business? Like, I'd love to explore that a little bit. Heard that's like, I guess, applying depressing to that, what you're talking about right now.
I think, look, this has a lot to do with investing in general. I mean, I think to underestimate the importance of sort of understanding the human dynamics of investments, I think is really problematic. And I think a lot of times what I saw over and over and over again was, very different expectations between the investors and the founders. I mean, I had a call this morning. It was really interesting with the woman that I know from Asia. And we were talking about publicly listed companies in Asia and how it's very common for Asian business families. They want to list their company because of the prestige and because there's certain security elements and things like that that come into play with a listed company that help to protect that investment, let's say. But at the end of the day, typically the family will continue to own the majority of that company, even though it's listed. So the free float is limited. So institutional investors don't want to invest in companies where there's a lack of liquidity. But the expectations among, let's say, Western investors is, well, we're going to invest in this company. It's going to IPO. We're going to be able to sell our shares, and make a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a bit
And it
like that, isn't
typically
it? Like
doesn't
just
work
that.
that way.
No.
Yeah. So who's wrong there? Who's wrong in that equation if it doesn't happen that way? Is it the Asian family, owned company that had its expectations around what an IPO meant to them? Or is it the institutional investors who had different expectations? And I'm
Mm,
not saying one is right or one is wrong, but the fact is there's a real malalignment there
yeah.
in what IPO actually means, right? So, and those kinds of things happened over and over and over again. If you look at, I can remember trying to restructure a very, very large company in Malaysia. I was brought in at a very senior level, and this company, it was a publicly listed company. I was sitting in with the task of removing the current CEO and replacing her with somebody else.
Um,
Um, and there was a whole story around why she couldn't be removed, and I won't get into it. But the point is that the needs or the expectations of the private equity investor that was the largest investor in that company and the founder of that company and his relationship with the CEO made it so that they were on opposite sides of one another. So even as I'm sitting in the middle and I've been appointed by the private equity investor to try and effect this restructuring, quietly, the founder is unable to allow the CEO to be replaced. I'm sitting in the middle, and these two are really butting heads with one another, and I'm supposed to try and,
fix it.
fix it. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting dynamics.
What did you do in those sorts of what do you do as a leader in those sorts of situations? Like, you're kind of in a bit of a rock and a hard place, and I'm asking you this because I think it's good for the listeners to hear this. And I mean, I've been caught in those, sorts of situations where, I had 3 founders, and then I was in the business and had equity in it, and sometimes getting caught between the 3 founders, it was just impossible to get. It was almost impossible to find a way forward because it was either 2 against 1, 1 against 2, like, it was always something. And so you're having to, on the spot, think on your feet. Like you were saying, great picture here because of all, like, you have to. Like, what were you doing in those situations? How were you navigating your way through it?
I think first and foremost, I mean, you try to, yeah, you have to find areas. I mean, for your own sort of mental health, you need to find ways in which you're adding value, regardless of
Yeah.
some of those dynamics that you can't change. I mean, I think in the course of things, we definitely we did a corporate restructuring. We created a new incentive program for many of the staff that were there. I think there were like 600 teachers. There was a for-profit education business. It was about a market cap was about a billion ringgit, a fairly sizable company. It had about 27,000 students and 5 campuses. So it wasn't a small business. So there was a lot of work to be done anyway. But that dynamic of trying to sort of remove the CEO and replace, we brought in a chief operating officer that sat below her. And I think he contributed for the time that he was there. But at the end of the day, I mean, and how do I say this? Ultimately, there is no winning in that scenario, right?
No.
So you have to also acknowledge, you have to take the wins where you can, but then also acknowledge when it's time to just move on.
Yeah.
And what I've realized is that actually, a lot of times, particularly in these kinds of restructurings with private equity firms, you become the fall guy. And so, in the event that it worked, the deal maker made the right choice. In the event that it doesn't work, then it's your fault. So, I
Yeah.
mean, you need to grapple with these kinds of things. But I mean, the point is that that kind of work became very, very common and very available for
Mm,
people with experience at the time that I was kind of still in Asia, but I was no longer on the investment side.
mm.
And it became difficult. It's just as a difficult way to work. I'd been in Asia for many, many years. So made the decision to move back. We owned a house in Malaysia. We sold the house and moved back and landed in Los Angeles. And I reconnected with an old friend who was just starting what's called the New Crop Capital Trust at the time. And that was one of the early investors that was focused on the sort of transitioning away from our dependence on animal agriculture and,
Yeah.
and focusing on that, what we refer to as the protein transition. And I really that resonated with me. These cycles, and kind of your point about the term sustainability.
Mm,
I think sustainability is useful in understanding that the systems are probably not sustainable in the way that they operate
100%.
today. And so when you think of sustainability, you're not talking about a forward approach. You're not talking about creating something that is sustainable in perpetuity. You're talking typically about things that are no longer sustainable
Mm,
based on the way we do them. And I think it's fair to say that, you look at the global population, you look at the way we produce food today, sort of the origins of that production, and sort of the revolution that led to this mass production that really lifted most of the world out of starvation. I mean, really, really impressive. But that approach is not sustainable as we move forward because um,
of the
it's
impact.
just land dependent.
Yeah.
And, if you look at the amount of arable land globally, we've already maxed that out. And I think we all know that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing some of the, impacts that we're seeing today, weather and so forth. It's because we're continuing to require more land to feed people than the earth can really, sensibly offer up. And so all of these climate change, initiatives and all of the SDGs and everything like that have all revolve around a climate, in my opinion, really come back to just basically land use. But anyway, I'll park that for a minute. So this idea of investing in something for a purpose really
Yeah.
really appealed to me at the time. So that's one of the reasons why I wound up joining New Crop, and New Crop eventually evolved into what we're referring to as Unovis asset.
So you seem like you're ahead of your time all the time. Like you start your career over in well, not start. You go to Asia, then you come into a real problem the planet is facing, society is facing. Unovis, where does that name come from? How did you transition then into Unovis? And what does it mean? Does it have something to do with the purpose and the impact you're making? Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me full disclosure, the first fund that we were investing had a single LP, and it was brought to me. The opportunity was brought to me by my partner Chris Kerr, and Chris was really sort of the pioneer, I would say, in kind of investing in this non-animal
Mm.
protein space. And he started his career in this area, working with the Humane Society of the United States. Through that relationship with the CEO, they hatched this idea of trying to raise money to change our dependence on animal agriculture, really from an animal rights perspective. And so, through that relationship, the Humane Society had something like 200 million in its corpus that was just sitting there. And so their plan was, well, let's use some of that money to support some of these early companies that are kind of pivoting away from, let's say animal based proteins. And that was both on the sort of alt dairy side and also very, very early investments relating to plant based meat, for example. And so through that relationship, the plan was to raise a fund together with the Humane Society, and go out and start investing in these kinds of companies. That plan never really worked. So Chris wound up doing a lot of advisory work. And one of the early companies that he advised was actually the predecessor to Beyond Meat. So we did actually make an investment on behalf of the Humane Society in Beyond Meat, and I think it was a small investment, maybe $500,000, something like that. That ultimately returned 43x on IPO. So they made it quite a fortune from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but anyway, Chris, there was a philanthropist who kind of caught wind of what Chris was working on and offered to set up something called the New Crop Capital Trust. And the New Crop Capital Trust was really one of the earliest investors in the alternative animal space, the protein space, and it had some interesting trustees. One of the trustees was a guy named Bruce Friedrich, and Bruce went on to set up what's called the Good Food Institute. So,
Mm.
so we kind of followed his work over the years, and the Good Food Institute's really well known
Yeah,
in our.
amazing. Do you wanna know a fun fact, Kim?
Sure. Yeah.
From my brand and advertising days, the agency last agency, we launched the first meat-free product here in Australia called
Oh, yeah.
Corn Q.
Yeah. Yeah. Corn. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
we launched it here in Australia. It was the first, yeah, it was a big campaign we did. We brought it in from the UK through Simplot was my client at the time. I had them for 8 years. So there you go. There's a little talk about little connections. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was ahead of its time at the time, and the education piece, and I guess that's probably a bit of a segue, right? How big, because that was back in the early 2000s that we launched that, or mid, probably 2010, 2012. How big is the market size now, like in terms of, when it comes to protein transition and, yeah, how big is it? And is it growing? Like, are people like, I mean, is it becoming a more growing market? You talked earlier around emerging complexity, and there is each day, it's not just rising anymore. There's complexity emerging by the second, or maybe I was making notes when you were talking. This is not just rising, it's emerging by the day. You talked about the land, you talked like what's happening in the world.
Yeah. I think, first and foremost, I mean, I can't really put a number on it these days. I mean, I think that the market, as we had anticipated, really didn't materialize. It's funny. I mean, and it's a whole discussion around food and how food works. But basically, I think when we really started investing in earnest, it was ahead of the curve. I mean, we were investing, through 2018, 2019, 2020. In 2020 was really sort of that surge of venture capital money that was raised. And it was raised for a whole host of reasons. I mean, it was low interest rates. I mean, there was sort of some economic drivers behind it, of course, but also there was kind of a surge of optimism around, sort of a need to address climate and a genuine desire, I think, on people's part that to invest in impactful things, broadly speaking. And that led to a bunker year or a banner year in fundraising. Vintage 2020, let's say 2021, 2020 and 2021, raised an enormous amount of venture capital money globally. And a lot of it was focused on things like impact driven theses, whether it was food or whether it was upcycling or water or, climate. And so that money that was raised, I think were things that were partially driven by optimism and not necessarily by sort of strong business fundamentals.
And do you think that's changed now? Like, do you think that, like, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the world is the way it is right now. Like, you talk about like impact and purpose driven, from a venture capital space. Do you think that we're losing sight of that? Is that, or do you think that, yeah, like
Well,
what's,
yeah, I forgot to mention one very, very important ingredient, and that was, COVID. So
yeah,
people were also
well,
focused on health, right? I mean, they were concerned, they locked up in their, they wanted to build community because they couldn't have community, right?
yeah,
Community
100%.
was online. I mean, they were lonely, but they wanted to be part of something bigger, bigger causes and things like that. And I think, that was a super interesting time, and I think it gave rise to a lot of optimism about how we could make the world better and things like that, and healthier and everything like that. But I mean, I think that's really changed dramatically. And I think part of it is sort of the disillusionment of the failure of a lot of those investments and a lot of those companies that were heavily funded, whether it made sense or not. But I think also, I mean, there's a sort of a period of pragmatism that's set in, and I think people recognize that the world's a pretty complex place. We've got a lot of challenges that we're trying to address at once, and not all of them are sort of moving in the same direction. A lot of them conflict with one another, and I just think, sadly, things like environment, they take a backseat to some of the more pressing issues, and I think economic concerns are really,
Big.
a lot of people are very, very focused on sort of their economic situation. There are asset classes that used to be not well represented in people's lives, but now people have come to realize the importance of those asset classes. And number one is things like real estate. Home ownership is formed the cornerstone of people's solvency and the cornerstone of wealth. home ownership is not accessible to most people nowadays in the same way that
No,
it,
it's
and so
changing.
valuations of houses globally, have just gone through the roof. And so it used to be that, young people could buy houses, and that was the cornerstone of a lifelong of building equity and things like that. And it's not possible in the same way. And then incomes in fundamental ways have not really risen, the cost of living. And so these are real issues, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we might want them, wish them to go away so we can focus on the things we care about. But at the end of the day, it's the big, it's the elephant in the room.
So what are you hopeful about then, Kim? What do you think is like what's a green shoot, so to speak, or what's like, what's something that you think is, because it is doom and gloom at the moment. Like, we just had another interest rate rise, third one in a row. Inflation is off its head here. It's the highest it's been in however long. You
Yeah.
just don't want to listen to the news, like, and yeah, it can get you down. And so then what are you optimistic about when it comes to, I guess a couple of questions from a, what are you optimistic about in the food system? And what are you optimistic about in the VC ecosystem, if you like? And then what are you optimistic about when it comes to founders and entrepreneurs, etc., of this very moment? And it's okay if you say I'm not optimistic at all, B. Like, I'm okay with that. I am an optimistic
Yeah.
person. I think we're at a really interesting point in time where everything is up for grabs, and it's almost like it kind of has to, like, we're at a crescendo, and it's almost like certain things have to fall apart. You talk about cycles, you have good cycles, shit cycles, like we're in a really not fun cycle at the moment, if that makes sense. So yeah, does that much of my questions make sense?
No, of course. And I think, yeah, I like you. I mean, I'm an optimist.
No, I know.
So at the end of the day, I mean, I think there'll always be challenges. There's been challenges when I sort of harken back to the days when I can remember sitting on the curb's edge in Hanoi. The power was out. There was nothing you could do for the whole afternoon because the power went out and the computers didn't work. And all you could do was sit and drink tea and kind of watch street level activity and watching the ladies that had come in to Hanoi from rural areas, cleaning plastic bags in the curb drain, which I don't even want to tell you what else floated in that drain, but cleaning these things off for resale. You think of those days, and then you all of a sudden think of where we are today and the kind of problems that, technology has created for us, but that has actually made its way all the way down to the very low levels of society. So people's lives broadly are better than they were, let's
Yeah,
say
so true.
years ago. I mean, substantially better, right?
Yeah.
So, and we're continuing to move in that direction. So you look at the problems that we face today, whether it's the advent of AI or, or these things. There are swings and roundabouts, and there are things that sort of evolve out of these kinds of trends. But I mean, I think the thing I'm encouraged by is that in the food system, when people talk about AI or what we're seeing is an increasing availability of information. So what people are learning about their health and what they're learning about the food system, to a certain extent, is putting pressure back on institutions to improve the quality of food,
Do better.
nutritional density, to acknowledge that there are other parts of the world that, they may get grain, but they're not getting an adequate amount of proper food. And we may not be doing anything today to address those needs in, let's say, the global south or whatever, but we have a level of information and knowledge that increasingly is available that previously was not. And that's true of the entire information age. It marches forward and it improves, and as it improves, we're confronted with these things that we really need to learn to grapple with. And so what you're seeing right now, I think, and this is just my opinion, but there's a bit of pushback right now on, all the things that we were told that we needed to address in the lives of people that live in distant lands and that aren't our problem, so to speak. I think to a certain extent we're seeing a bit of that, and I think that's one of the whole sort of broad pushback on things like, let's say, liberal type issues. I think people are generally saying, "Hey, I've got problems here. I don't have time to focus on those folks."
Yeah.
I think what we'll see is that, we'll see a gradual recognition that actually we are interconnected, and these problems need to be solved not just for ourselves but for others, because they ultimately come back to affect us.
Yeah, completely.
And I think, I think Donald Trump has done a wonderful job of highlighting some of these things because, it was unintentional, but, you know, and I shouldn't launch into politics, but I mean, I to a certain extent, I think, the more we're confronted with what doesn't work, and whether it's something that, for example, the EU in its current form doesn't work, right? And I think even people in the EU have come to recognize that
Admit
there's
it, yeah.
need for change. And so we need to address, this is the largest market in the world. It's larger than the United States. And by all rights, it should function as the largest market. And I think we're starting to see, you know, some motivation to try and change that. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic about democracy. I think there's a lot of countries in the world that are starting to demand greater accountability. Places like Bangladesh and Nepal and Hungary. I mean, these are all big issues, of course. But I think within the food system, the big one for me is just greater information around what we're consuming, where it comes from, its nutritional density, what we need as humans to improve our health, things like that. I mean, I think that's really important.
I agree, and it comes right back to longevity as well, right? Like
Yeah.
it's understanding what we're consuming, what it's doing to our bodies, also what it's doing to the planet, what it's doing to like it's an ecosystem, and it's somewhat disconnected. Okay, two final questions. We've been talking for 40 minutes. We've been in such a flowy conversation. Just yeah, and I'm loving our glasses. Just for all the listeners, we didn't even think on the glasses. It's a good
Yeah, yeah.
content. You've got it going on. You got your cool little. I shouldn't say little, kind of big. Yours are like yeah. I love specs. So you got a daughter and a son. You said 20, and I think you said 20 and 23, and you mentioned the son's is pursuing a hip hop career, and then your daughter is pursuing. I can't even remember exactly what you said, and I'm going to let you explain it. The question
Yeah. I mean,
I
it,
have
she
is,
um
yeah, you go.
she's she's very interested in climate justice. So she's been studying international relations just because that's the catch-all in which these kinds of things are captured. But she's interested in human rights, international human rights. She's interested in indigenous rights, but sort of international climate justice for those communities that can't necessarily adequately defend themselves against the bigger nations. I think that's a pretty aspirational focus.
And your son?
My son, he was interested in coral ecology, and as he was going around to look at universities with his mother, he had a hobby, and the hobby was that he was really into writing and singing hip hop and R&B. He was like kind of a rapper, but he was writing his own lyrics, and we didn't really know that much about it. We just knew it was a hobby. But he came across this program in New Orleans, Loyola University in New Orleans. It's a specific program that's set up. It's a hip hop and R&B music program, and it's a Bachelor of Science in music production. It's a it's a one of a kind type program, and he just fell in love with it, and he's been producing a lot of his own music. He's a very talented young guy. I mean, he's really found his voice. From his life experiences, he was born in Singapore, raised in Malaysia, in the Netherlands. He as a child, he lived in Vietnam, southern Vietnam. So he's had an interesting life experience, as well as living in Los Angeles. And so, yeah, he's brought a lot of his life experience into his lyrics, and yeah, he's loving.
And my question is, because there's such diverse, right? And I think you're out the younger generation, and this is my second last question to you. Very diverse. Yet they could come together in such a unique, like, and I'm just thinking about the younger generation and what they're like, what they're upskilling themselves in, what they're being skilled in, the passion and the purpose they have. You talk about music as a science, and then what your daughter's doing. Do you see that we're going to have more and more of that cross collaboration, in business going forward, in terms of, if I come right back to to solve problems, to solve the problem of like the food ecosystem, and I guess really like, complex problems, if you like. Do you think that there's opportunity there in terms of bringing more of diverse experiences and skills to come together to solve these, I guess, more yeah, big problems that we have in the world. Like, do you know where I'm going with this? Like, in terms of your son's doing this, you could argue it's just R&B, it's just hip hop. There's a science behind it. And then your daughter, and I just thought about it when you were telling me pre-show, and I just think it's really interesting. And I think that we need to be looking outside of the systems we're in to solve the problems that need to be solved, and solved for good, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think in the world of today, information is just constantly buzzing past us and trying to get people's attention around things that are important. I mean, I think social influencers, whether they're artists or movie stars, whatever. I mean, people that are able to draw people's attention into issues that are important for them to focus on. I think that's really, really important, and that can be done through lyrics. That can be done through. I mean, in the case of my daughter, she's not a. This doesn't necessarily reflect her personality, but litigation. What we've taught her is that litigation is the way to change policy. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, if you look at ways, whether it's human rights abuses or whether it's climate injustice, the way to really bring attention to that issue is through the courts, and whether it's the International Human Rights Court here in the Hague or individual civil courts in the United States or other places. I mean, I think you need to be able to play to where people where decisions ultimately get made and where money is spent and where people are impacted in ways that cause them to change their behavior. And I think in a very similar way, if you can't draw people's attention through culture and through things like social media to important issues in this day and age, then you're missing out on a very big opportunity to
Agree.
really focus
Yeah,
people's.
I agree. And then last but not least, Kim, what I guess it's a broad question. If there was one thing each of us could do right now, and to my listeners and myself that I'm talking about, what is one thing we could do? And I'm going to bring it right back to to food and the ecosystem. What's one thing we could do to make just a slight difference for good, to be better? Like, what's one little thing we could all do when we wake up tomorrow, or as soon as we get off this podcast, what is one little thing we could all do to make an impact within the food ecosystem right now? It's a big question, I guess, isn't it?
No, I mean, for me, it's a really easy one. It's just that it's not easy for people to hear necessarily. And that is, the biggest, in terms of land use and in terms of, sort of inefficiency of calories and things like that. I mean, it takes nine calories of consumption on the part of, let's say, a chicken to produce 1 calorie of food for humans. So, I mean, the inefficiency of animal agriculture is tremendous. So I'm not telling people not to continue to eat animals, or meat. But if you just be cognizant of how inefficient beef is, for example, to consume, and what the impact is, what the climate impact is of that decision to consume beef. I'm not saying don't eat it, but eat it less. And when you do, don't waste any of it, and recognize that it is genuinely a luxury comestible. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
something that should be
Good
taken for
call out.
granted, and beef shouldn't be wasted. And I
Yeah.
think please just give things like some meat analogs, like, things like burgers. If you're going to consume a burger, just try a plant-based burger, because actually the experience is not dissimilar to that of a beef burger. It really isn't.
No, I agree.
And I'm not saying center of the plate, piece of steak, you're not going to be able to replace a center of the plate piece of steak, but and so enjoy it, enjoy it. Don't enjoy it all the time, but enjoy it occasionally, and really don't waste it. But with things like, burgers and chicken nuggets and all that sort of stuff, give plant-based a try, because actually it pretty much serves the purpose.
Thank you, Kim. No, I love it. And it's just, and I think it all comes back to being intentional in what you're doing, and like it comes back to all of us just being a bit more intentional in what we're doing and thinking about it a bit more than just consuming. Kim, what a conversation. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. And I know I put it off a couple of weeks ago, and we certainly made the most of today. I do really appreciate your time. How do we find out more about Unovis Asset Management? How do we find out more about you?
I guess through LinkedIn. I mean, I generally follow up with people. I mean, if they have a genuine interest in some of the things that we're working on, we have a website, of course,
Yeah,
but I
I'll
think
share all that in the notes, show notes. Kim, thank you so much. Really appreciated your time and yeah, wishing you all the best for the rest of the week and beyond. And I've certainly had quite a few takeaways. You've also just also reiterated to me quite a few things around, that everything is a cycle. And, even though we're in this crazy cycle at the moment, it's a cycle. And, that from I guess from rising complexity, emerging complexity, that's where if we dig deep, we can actually truly solve some really some really big problems. And yeah, I think the one big thing that came out for me as well was just the intentionality around food, but also human dynamics and the human dynamics when it comes to investing, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to anything at the end of the day. We are all human. And so I think that it's important that we all come together because as a society and as us all coming together, that's when we can make the profound change and impact that we really do need in this world right now. So thank you for all your amazing insights, your shares, Kim. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.
no, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much, B.
No, you're welcome. Okay.